The Pinkertons, Chapter 9. Do you remember the Pinkertons' family rule? The ban on music with words. If you do, then you might think that Patty and Percival were being deliberately disobedient, that they must have known their parents would disapprove of the purchase of the clockwork radio. But the truth is that despite the numerous times in which the family rule had been drilled into them, in the excitement of the carrot crunch incident, it had totally and completely gone out of their heads. The pair must have spent some little time in the Emporium, because by the time they left, the market was over, and the crowd of guinea pigs had all gone, save for a few market stall holders who were packing away their boxes and awnings. Patty looked around. There was definitely no sign of her parents. Patty realised that Cynthia and Claude must have left without them. This did happen from time to time. It was never that her parents were being deliberately unkind or negligent. It was just that every so often they would simply forget that the children had been with them. Patty and Percival were thankfully of an age where this wasn't too much of a disaster. They could easily make their own way home. It was on the way home that the penny dropped, for Patty at least. It became clear to her that Cynthia and Claude would strongly disapprove of the clockwork radio. For what were radios for, if not for listening to songs? Now, you, dear reader, might answer that there are plenty of other uses for a radio, for there are orchestral pieces, dramatisations of classic novels, plays, news from around the world, and all sorts of things. But you have to remember that Patty and Percival had never had a radio, and so their experience, which was purely from when they visited the houses of their friends, was pretty limited. What Patty had noticed, though, was that when the radio was playing in a friend's house, nothing terribly untoward seemed to happen. In fact, nothing at all had happened. So what on earth was all the fuss about from her parents? There did seem to be, Patty thought, one or two overly soppy songs played over and over and over again on the radio, and there were also some very silly chat shows. But then again, one didn't have to listen to those. There was an off switch, after all, which, she noticed, her friends' parents made good use of. And I should say, dear reader, that in my opinion it is always a good idea to familiarise yourself with the off switch on any device, and to make good use of that switch. Now, I am very sorry to have to tell you that before Patty and Percival had reached their front door, they had made a decision. And they had made a decision to try to deceive their parents. Patty devised an elaborate plan to enable her to smuggle the radio into the house without her parents noticing, by using Percival as a decoy. His job would be to distract his parents with the hay twists. However, as things panned out, Patty and Percival had no need to activate their plan, for Mr. and Mrs. Pinkerton had not returned home. Cynthia and Claude had bumped into their neighbours, the Silkies, at the market, and Sylvia Silky had offered to show Cynthia her new dahlia, which had recently come into flower for the first time, and Cynthia Pinkerton could never, ever resist such an invitation. So Patty and Percival were able to get the clockwork radio inside the house without anyone asking any questions at all. The only inhabitant at home, apart from them, was Oliver the Newt, and he seemed singularly uninterested. But then Patty and Percival were faced with another dilemma. Where could they hide it? The Pinkertons' house was not large, and the radio was not small. Suddenly, Patty had a brainwave. How about hiding it in the bottom of her mother's closet? It was the perfect place. There were all sorts of things down there, and Cynthia never seemed to use any of them, or even to really be aware that the items were even there. Mrs. Pinkerton never, ever had clear-outs, as some mothers are prone to do. Patty put down the radio on the hay floor and went over to the closet. Percival, who had followed his sister into the room, stopped and looked at the clockwork radio. He spotted the wind-up handle on the side. His parents were out. It was now or never, he thought. He began to wind the handle. It made a small but satisfying ratcheting sound, pleasing to his ear. Meanwhile, Patty had opened the closet door and looked inside. It would probably be best to hide the radio beneath plenty of other boxes and bags, she thought, to be on the safe side. She began to rummage through what was there. It was quite interesting. There was a pale blue scarf that she had never seen her mother wear. It was actually quite attractive, Patty thought. She picked it up and wrapped it around herself as a sash. Then she studied herself in the mirror that hung on the adjacent wall. "Oh, I do look rather fine," she thought to herself. She returned to the closet. She wondered what else she would find. There was an odd sock, a battered notebook, a small coin, several buttons, an old teddy with only one eye, but who still seemed rather merry, a violin case, empty, unfortunately, and, I'm afraid to say, a fair bit of dust as well. But there was something else too, something Patty had never seen before, something wrapped in green tissue paper. Percival had finished winding the handle. He was now fiddling with buttons, trying to tune the radio. It did not tune to a station automatically, so the initial sound coming from the clockwork radio was static, which wasn't particularly pleasant. But then he managed. It was a man singing, with a Liverpudlian accent. He sang, "In the town where I was born lived a man." While Sylvia Pinkerton was admiring her friend Sylvia Silky's beautiful orange dahlia, Claude and Sylvia's husband, Sam, were discussing the chances of the Haypepper Harriers in their upcoming match against the Sweetbriar Sweepers, which was due to take place the following weekend. The match in question was, of course, a regular fixture for the third division of the Noring Noseball League. Noring Noseball was a skilled and complex sport, only rarely played by non-guinea pigs. The rules were complicated, and to be good at the game required dexterity of both the nose and the teeth. I suppose that dexterity is not quite the correct word here, referencing as it does the right hand, for hands, right or left or otherwise, don't really come into the sport of Noring Noseball at all. Touching the rattan ball with any paw is, of course, strictly forbidden under Regulation 8.3, subsection 26. Haypepper Amendment of 1824 applies. Noring Noseball is a difficult game to follow, as although goals score points, so too does the gnawing of the twigs found at either end of the field, with 5 points scored for a small piece of bark being removed, or 10 for what is known as a strip the willow, which is not to be confused with the Scottish dance, although host teams often do invite their opponents to a lively guinea pig ceilidh on the pitch post-match, but this has no official role in terms of the scoring. Tactics, therefore, can vary quite a bit in Noring Noseball. For example, in deciding how many players should attempt to be working to score goals, or in defence, as opposed to how many players should be spending time gnawing on the twigs. And some strategies are more in vogue than others at particular times. There have been notable variations in strategy over the years, decades, and indeed centuries, for Noring Noseball is a very old game indeed. Some tactics are just to do with what is fashionable right now, but how the team decides to approach a game can also depend on the particular skill set of the players in the team at any given point. For example, if you had a player who was especially quick at scoring a strip the willow, then it might make more sense for him to spend the whole match in that role, gnawing on twigs, rather than putting him or her into midfield at all. I was mentioning earlier that dexterity was not really the correct word for what I wanted to say. but I'm not sure we do have the correct words in English. Do we have words that mean you are particularly nimble with your nose or speedy with your teeth? If we do, then I'm afraid I don't know what they are. Maybe you can tell me. In guinea pig, of course, they do have such words, possibly due to the prevalence and popularity of the sport we have been discussing. The guinea pig word for dexterity of the teeth is illy, ollie, ooh, ooh. Literally, this translates as nifty nibbler. It was as Sam and Claude were discussing the sweeper's likely defence strategy that all four of the guinea pigs, Claude, Sam, Cynthia and Sylvia, found themselves lifted up into the air.